So in the following videos, I'm going to go through a selection of what was covered in your reading that comes from 100 Design Principles for Using Grids, which is a book by Beth Tondro, rather. I'm not going to go through all of the principles that I've put in the selection of reading for you guys, but rather kind of pull out ones that I think are emblematic. And obviously, that reading doesn't go through all of the design principles that she uses. So think of this as like a select of the selects. I'm going to break the video up into 3 parts just to make it a little bit more digestible. So whenever there is a title slide on the slide PowerPoints, and you know that that will be broken for another video. So this particular entry is actually further down in the book, but I feel like it kind of sums up a number of the first entries where it's talking about kind of setting up a system that will allow for versatility. And in the first couple of entries, it's talking about, thinking about how you're going to lay out material, assessing what material it is that you have to work with, images, text, captions, pull quotes, subheaders, headers, all of these things, and thinking about the best way to put things together so that you can use space to communicate. And in the following entries, you kind of give very specific ways to approach this. But overall, thinking about the fact that if you've got a really versatile system, then you can have all these different pieces of information work together in a way that is consistent, makes sense to the viewer, and also makes your life easier too. You can break the page up into many different subdivisions of the page. You can break it up into halves, thirds, quarters, and then also subdivide it horizontally. And as you can see in the image examples here, you can see very fine lines for where the grid lands to give you a sense of how the designer has used the grid in order to enact their design. Now, a lot of this kind of grid work, and again, this is in the introduction, kind of comes out of how the Swiss designers approach the grid system. Grid systems have been around for absolute ages, but there were pioneers within the kind of Swiss approached design that then becomes known as the international style that really push the use of grid and use it in a way that's very visually appealing and really interesting. So a quote from Alan Lupton's book, the Swiss designers used the confines of a repeated structure to generate variation and surprise. Key things we're going to touch upon later in these slides. A system allows for both dense and spacious pages within the same project. And so I think the fact that it helps the reader not read, as we've discussed, but it also helps you design. It makes it really clear for you where you're going to place information, how you can take what you need to work with and deploy it quickly and easily. So it helps both. A strong grid is going to support variations. It's going to help you work with various image sizes. And it's not actually something that's stifling. I think a lot of times people think of grids as cold and rational and inhuman, when in fact, if you use them really well, and the following slides have some tips on how to do that, it can be really visually dynamic, but yet make life easy for the reader and the designer. And some more examples. So this spread here, it shows how a grid can accommodate a sidebar, illustrations, imagery, as well as all of the text, and still have white space, areas for your eyes to rest. And you can see how the designer used color as a way to group things. So again, remembering our Gestalt principles and the fact that we're going to consider information together if it's bounded in, say, a box that's got a gray color, so we know that that all is part of the same information. And then the text that sits on the white, we know goes together because that's sitting on the white. And then we have this really interesting image that breaks between the two and is wrapped around by the text. So you kind of have this interest of like, oh, I think this actually applies to both parts. So it's interesting. So this magazine article employs a flexible system, and it's actually reviewing the work of someone who used grids. So of course you're going to use a grid system in order to display the work of someone who loves grids, of course. So I thought that was a really great example. And going back to what we've discussed in terms of helping the reader not read, remember to go easy on the reader. So space matters just as much as size of the text itself. Thinking about where your headers are, if there's any running text, like say you're in a magazine or a book, do you need page numbers? Do you need these visual calls to let the reader know what section of the book that they're in? And as well, things like space around your header, any captions, notes, etc. it gives the reader a sense of the pacing of the page and of the work in it. So to make a lot of very varied material easy to understand, easy for the reader to understand what goes together, again thinking back to our Gestalt principles, or what is the most important information for them to pick out on the page. Use your space in order to make it really clear. So here we can think of pull quotes, kind of like sound bites. So you can use sidebars, and again, we're using actual boxes in order to make it really clear to the reader. We're using color to make clear to the reader what's important, as well as bolding, as well as size. And so organizing your typography can make it really easy for the viewer to understand what's happening and what the most important information is. Now, when you're setting up your grid in the first point, make sure that you consider all the elements you're going to need to work with. So are you designing a book where you have text, images, subheaders, running titles at the top, page numbers, captions, etc.? Is it a magazine where maybe the images are more important, but there's still going to be text and the incorporation of it? And so make sure that you know, is it just a straight text? You're doing a novel, and there's maybe some imagery on a couple of pages, but overall it's just body text throughout. So making sure that the grid that you set up at the beginning actually can incorporate everything that you need to work with. So here is an example, the last page, and this one is from a project that was done by the National Design Museum in association with the Cooper Hewitt and Smithsonian. And we're looking at ways of weaving textiles and weaving different forms of information together. And so again, thinking about the concept of what it is that they're talking about, as well as all the information that they're looking to convey. So if you successfully balance your grid here, so then we can kind of like have weight to different information. So in this case, we've got this narrow column, and then we've got a wider column, which is kind of twice the width of the smaller column that has the caption. So there's balance in terms of, we understand that one is 1/3 the size of the, or it's half the size of the other piece that's 2/3. And it's the same typeface. So we know that there's a relationship between these parts of text. And then we've got the header, which is in a different typeface, but it shares a color with these lines that are used in order to like convey meaning. So there's a lot of different weight and different visual information, but the way that it's set on the page makes it really easy for the viewer to understand. When you have only a few images or no images, then you can let the weight of the text kind of stand up for itself. So here again, if you think of this 2-page spread, you've got the white space where on the right-hand page where you've got captions on the left-hand page. And so here the rule, that line, acts as a design element that reminds us why the kind of break is there, but it also then helps balance the visual imagery on the page. Now, here we have a really wonderful kind of maximalist design. So think about space and how either filling the space or leaving gaps can communicate just as well. I absolutely love that this font is called Restraint. Clearly, there is not much restraint in terms of form being applied here. Marianne Montez's work is absolutely gorgeous, and if you get a chance to have a look at her, she's an absolute master of typography. So remember that even though your grid needs to be strong enough to hold a lot of information, there's often times a lot communicated by where you leave gaps, where there are empty squares, as well as where you have squares filled. So here we have the Restraint font deployed alongside other pieces. So space sets off a message. It gives room for the reader to understand the text. It allows your eye to rest in different places. A large amount of space creates drama and focus as well. And it can signal luxury or importance. So if you leave white space, in fact, we often associate that with something that is luxurious, something that has the ability to almost kind of waste the space on the page. You don't need to fill it with ink because you have the restraint to do that. There's definite a kind of upscale aesthetic to leaving space for your eye to rest. And you can see that in this end user license agreement for the font restraint, they actually kind of set it in a way as to kind of demonstrate this luxury. So filling modules in the center of a piece, and you leave space around the edge that kind of allows the edge to look as like a frame. Or you can use the modules of the text here as a frame. In all cases, showing restraint marks the difference between cacophony and a symphony. So here everything works together really well, even though it's very maximalist. There's so much going on the page. It still has that really refined look to it because of how they've used the pieces. That it isn't just a mash like a David Carson design where there's things going on everywhere all the time and your eye doesn't know where to look. Instead, the white space, the negative space, guides you through the design. So in the next set, we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use that grid and specifically use it to be dynamic.